Now, before we start adding any more nodes to this and really editing it, I want to show you the difference between a noise node and a fractal node, because they do work quite differently and they produce entirely different results. So what I'm going to do is just click next to our fractal, our simple fractal, and create one of these red boxes in sort of the invisible area. Now what I'm going to do is select our Add Noise node. Now we can already see the differences within the preview, and basically it is the amount of detail. Noise nodes are very smooth nodes and don't have nearly as much detail as a simple fractal does, or a fractal node. So let's go ahead and just delete this line that we have connecting our fractal to our altitude, and we're going to connect our altitude to our output of our noise node. Now if we take a look in our preview, we can see we have a very smooth terrain, and there's really not a whole lot of detail to it. But these are still very useful because they allow us to create very simple shapes to define exactly how our terrain is going to look like in certain areas. And then we can also use combiner nodes along with our fractal nodes to add that extra bit of detail. Very similarly to the way we used our standard terrain to get our initial shape and then add our details on top of it. It is also a good way to take a look at the overall look of specific functions, because a lot of the different nodes and different options that we have are similar and almost exactly the same throughout our noise nodes and our fractal nodes. So if we take a look at our fractal right now, we'll go ahead and click on that. Our noise settings, right now we're just set to that simple fractal 2. We can see we have cellular patterns, distributed patterns, flat patterns, line patterns, math patterns, other patterns, Perlin noises, and our square patterns. And now if we switch over to our noise node and take a look, we can see we have exactly all of the same options for creating our different patterns. Of course, these patterns are a bit reduced once we are using our noise nodes, and that's basically because they give us, just like I said, that overall look rather than all of the intricate details in there. So let's compare some of these, and we can take a look at what's creating each one of these, and where we have our base model for the noise node, and then our detailed intricate model from our fractal. So we're going to go to value, and let's take a look at some of our options here. We can go to cellular patterns and select chipped, and now we can see the noise node version of chipped. Let's go into our simple fractal, and actually one thing I want to do is make these settings the exact same. So I'm going to delete our current fractal, add in a new fractal, and now what it's actually done is remembered the settings from the previous fractal, and I want this to be completely new. So I'm going to change our wavelength to 1 on all axes and set our origin to 0. But in this case, what we might actually have to do is change our wavelength to make it a little bit smaller. Because if we take a look at our noise nodes, we can see our overall scale is adjusted by a specific number, where we have a scale of 10 right now. So as I increase this scale, it changes basically what our wavelength is at. If I adjust the scale down a little bit further, we can see we have a very tight production of all these different options. If I make it a little bit larger, then we can really see we're pretty zoomed in there. So I'm going to change that back to 10 and go to our simple fractal, and we're going to change this to our cellular patterns. Select our chipped so that we're the same on both. Reduce our wavelength to 0.2. And now we're basically the same size for both of these nodes, and we can see the previews of each of them. we can tell immediately, just by the preview, how much extra detail is available within our fractal as opposed to our noise. So if I just grab our connection from our noise node and drag that over to our fractal node, and we also want to make sure with this circle that we're actually dragging this onto the actual node and not just in the circle. We want to make sure we're above the halfway point so that we're on the actual node, otherwise it won't connect. So now we can see the major differences that we have by using the same type of overall pattern, but with the noise node as opposed to our fractal node. And that's because with fractal nodes, we have all of these extra options in here. We have our largest feature, our smallest feature, and roughness. If I was to decrease our roughness down to basically 0, then we end up with an exact same look as our noise node. So fractal nodes give us the ability to add that roughness, which really gives us the look of that terrain. So they're basically the same in that relationship, although the way the patterns are created are a little bit different. And of course, we have many more options of adjusting our certain nodes because we can change our largest feature and our smallest feature, where if we go to our noise node, we really only have the option to change our scale, wavelength, and origin. And we also have those options available except our scale, although by adjusting our wavelength, we can easily adjust that scale. Same thing with our wavelength of our noise node. I can decrease our wavelength, and let's go to 0.5, and it's basically the same as adjusting our scale. It's just that scale is an overall extra option, which kind of overrides what we have as our wavelength. And it's something a little bit simpler that's completely constrained in proportion to what we already have our wavelength set to. And that's really something that's nice too if you're going to be working with uneven numbers. Currently right now I have a 0.5 on all of our axes, but if I was to change this to 0.72, and then on the x we did 0.25, and then on our z we did 1.223, now we've set up a specific size that we would like to use. And I'm just going to reconnect this to our noise node. And let's say we wanted to make this a little bit larger, but we didn't want it to calculate our wavelengths over again and have to type in those numeric values and use cross multiplication to figure out exactly the right proportions and keep it the same. Well, this way we can just use our scale and we stay in those exact proportions of our wavelength, but adjust the overall size. So that's extremely helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete this noise node. And we're going to work with our fractal. I'm going to reconnect our altitude to our fractal, so that way we can see it. And I'm also going to change this back to a different one. We're going to go to our Perlin noises value, which gives us a nice overall looking terrain. And rather than adjusting our wavelength, I'm just going to adjust our overall scale of our preview. And then if we want this terrain to show up correctly in the terrain editor and in our scene, all we need to do is fit our scale from 1, which is right now, this is how it will look like when we click OK to end out our function. But all we need to do is match up the scale number with the number for our node in the function editor, or within the terrain editor for our function, and then we'll be able to see the exact same effects that we're seeing right now. Although sometimes, because we have fit vertically on, we might notice that it's a little bit higher in some of our areas than our output. So really whether or not you want to use the wavelength setting or adjust the scale in here is entirely up to you, depending on what's easiest for you and what sort of settings you need to change. So now that we have this cut in half, I'm also going to adjust our wavelength, just so everything is a little more uniform. and just have 0.1 on all of those. And let's just start out by taking a look at our filter nodes. So what we want to do is define exactly where we want our filter to be, and there are only certain places where we can put our filter. In this case, we want to put them in our connection between our node and our output of our fractal into our output node, which is our altitude. So we want to click on our line connecting these two and select filter. If I was to select our top option and select filter, you can see that nothing will happen, and that's because we cannot connect a filter node there. Also note that if we right mouse click in the gray area, we can choose from all of the different options and nodes that are available, and also specifically which one we want. So rather than just creating a fractal node, we can choose exactly which fractal node we'd like to create. A basic repeater, a simple fractal, a fast Perlin fractal, variable roughness, all the way down to our open ocean. Same thing with all of our other different nodes, and we can also choose all of our input nodes, which we have a variety of different ones available, but the majority of these we'll be using for creating materials rather than actually editing our terrains. So let's take a look at this filter. What we can do right now, we just see our filter showing up. If I want, I can click Show in Graph, and then we can see what the filter is actually going to do to our node. I'm going to zoom in so we can see that a little bit better, and now we can really see that overall effect. And now we have a bunch of different options for our filters, and if we click on it, this little arrow, we can see all of the different available filters. And all of these are available right now for editing our terrain, although in some cases we might not actually get an effect from them. But overall, we can pretty much use all of these. Our first one, and by default, is just the normal filter. This allows us to edit our filters as we would with any other filter within View. So I can right mouse click, go to Edit Filter, and that's going to open up our filter options and our filter designer. And what we can do now is define the profile and the overall shape directly connected to our fractal node that we have by using points and also a number of different options. Like we have an Influence of Environment tab. This allows us to adjust dependent of altitude, dependent on slope, dependent of orientation. And these are very helpful when you're trying to achieve specific looks, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But first, let's take a look at just editing this filter. And one thing to note too is we can either customize our own, and I'm just going to close this out really quick. If we right mouse click, we can see we also can load in filters. And just like the gradients before, one of the nice things about our filters is they are available throughout the entire program. So any filter that you create for anything can be used on any filter. So in this case, we could use our time splines to create a filter for this terrain. We could also use the specific terrain profiles. You can create your own personal library. You can use the round clips, the saturation, and any of these different values will allow you to edit your filter. I'm just going to create something custom. Let's right mouse click, go to Edit Filter, open up those options. And what we can do is zoom in and out of our filter. Although typically the view that we have by default is usually good enough because we're just expanding upon from 1 to -1 on both of our axes for our filter, and really going beyond that isn't necessary, at least for not for these settings. We can also adjust whether or not we'd like to show our grid, which can be very helpful. We can also snap our points to our grid once that is turned on. Let's go ahead and we're just going to click anywhere we want to add a point. So if I want to add a point right here where my cursor is, I'll just click, and now we can see the position updates on the bottom in the key point section. And no matter where I click, we see that update. and it's remembering where we want to put our next key point. So I'll just click in here. It remembers on the X and the Y where our key point should be, and we'll click New Key Point. We can also see that we have a linear filter right now. In other words, we have some very sharp edges, which will end up creating very sharp looks for our terrain. Now you can see already as I'm editing and adjusting this filter that our output observer is updating automatically. So it's a real-time effect where we can make modifications while we're still in the filter and we don't have to close it out to see exactly what it is creating, which is extremely helpful. So if I move this over to the side, we can see that sort of adjustment already being created. Now because we're working with, like I said, a linear filter, we can see we have some very sharp points and very sharp cutoffs for certain areas of our terrain. Now if that's the look you're going for, then you'll want to leave a linear filter. Otherwise, we want to turn curves on. So we're going to turn on smooth curve mode, which is going to give us a nice nonlinear filter where we can easily adjust these points and the tangents between them. We also get these nice little handles that allow us to modify our curves, and also gives us the ability to use less key points to create certain effects. Now typically, if we were working in a linear mode, in non-curve mode, we would have to create several points to create this up and down pattern. But since we have our curve mode on, we can just adjust our controller and create that overall hump that we've created. You can see we have an auto tangent mode. If I turn that on, it's just going to automatically set basically the default for our specific tangent. But if we have our smooth joint, we can also turn that on if we go ahead and modify that. And then we can turn that on and off. And basically when we're looking at this filter, the left point of our filter, where we have -1, -1, is the lowest part of our terrain. And where we have 1, 1 meeting up for our X and our Y, we have the highest point of our terrain. And then what we can do is modify whether or not we want a linear blend between our geometry and elevation, or we can adjust and make that nonlinear and create some really neat looking effects. If you also take a look at the actual filter, we can see the preview of what this is doing to our gradient. And that can kind of give you a better idea of what is going to be created because of the way that we know that white is going to be the highest point of our terrain and black is going to be the lowest. So we can see how we edit our filters, how that adjusts our overall value. And now you can see we have some areas where it's sort of dipping down because of this area that we have dipped down. If we bring that up higher, we'll notice that on our higher peaks where we can see those sort of dipping inward and then coming back up. If I go all the way to the right and bring that down, then our highest point and our highest peaks are going to start to be reduced. And now they're at a much lower area. And I could bring that down even further. And we can see that expand, and we have larger holes. I can move this out to our center. And now we can see a much more dramatic effect. And we end up with a really interesting looking terrain. We can adjust that. And that will create a much sharper edge. I'm going to go ahead and pull that back. And now you can see once we extend beyond the highest point, we're starting to cut off the top of our terrain. So if I move this over, we're moving along our elevation and throughout our different values and cutting it off all the way at the top. So if that's the effect you're looking for, then you want to go over If not, you want to make sure that your curves do not extend beyond the boundaries. You can see we can pull up our areas in the front and get some different effects that way. Modify that. And now if we wanted to also adjust our starting point, we want to click, and as we drag, we can see we're creating a selection box, but our key point is also remembering exactly where we are at. So if we click and drag all the way down to -1, -1, then we're all the way in the lower left corner. So I can click New Key Point, and now we can adjust this side as well. And now because I have fit vertically on, some of these settings are not showing up correctly. So if I turn off fit vertically, we can see it a little bit better. So if I lower this left side, we'll see our lower points start to come down a little. If I raise that up really high, then we're going to see those lower points extend a little bit more. We could also raise that up, and that will start to flatten out. I'm going to turn that back on our fit vertically. Just turn that down. And now right now I'm just using one point, but we can of course use several points to define these certain areas. You can also see just with this one right now we have this nice little curve which is creating a really neat looking plateau between our different elevations. I'm going to click in here and add another key point, and we can adjust this. Move that up. And now you can see the terrain is a little bit more interesting. Where we had those plateau areas are now being cut down before they reach the plateau to create a nice little ridge that carries out throughout our terrain. So there's a lot we can do with filters, and it's really nice having the output observer open while we're playing with our filters and adjusting the settings, and that way we can get exactly what it is that we want, see an instant preview, and not have to worry about not having it set correctly. And we'll come back and take a look at some of these other modes a little bit later. So go ahead and I'm just going to exit out of this, and that's going to just reset our filter. But we also have a lot of other filters available, and not just a straight curve that we're working with, but a lot of these different settings. We have a partial filter, which works the same way as our regular filter, except we can adjust the overall effectiveness of that curve. So let's just create another simple filter really quick. I'll just modify that. We can see the effect that's creating. And now if we take a look at the ratio, that is going to be what's adjusting the overall effectiveness and how much influence this curve and filter is causing to our terrain. So if I increase this all the way up to 1, then we're going to get the full effect of our filter. If we bring it down to 0, we're not going to see the filter at all. So this allows us to adjust basically the opacity of our filter and how much it affects our terrain, which is quite cool. We can also adjust our filter ratio based on a node, which is also even more helpful. So let's go ahead and change this from a partial filter, and you can see we also have an offset, and this is an offset x plus a, and we can adjust our filter by bringing it down. And now we really want to pay attention to just this overall color to really see what it is that this filter is doing. And as we bring up our offset, you can see we're raising our brightness value and raising up our terrain. Let's go ahead and change that. We have an opposite, which is going to be opposite -x, which is just going to basically flip around the filter that we have and give us a negative value. If we take a look compared to our fractal and then what happens once we hit our opposite filter, we can see that the darkest points, or the lowest points on our fractal, once it hits the filter, those are now the highest points, and the other way around. Where we can see the black right here, where it's white on our fractal. So that will basically just invert our overall terrain shape. And there actually is an invert option, but typically the opposite filter will work a lot better because invert can sometimes throw off your entire scene and not give you what you're looking for at all. We also have a multiply function. We can just increase that. And basically what that is doing is adjusting our our gain in our overall fractal. And this can also be controlled by a node as well. And just an extra little bit of options that we have in there. And like I said, we can connect this to different nodes, but some of them won't necessarily be able to be replaced by other nodes or connected directly to other nodes. So some of these options will not work. So if I say I wanted to, let's go ahead and extract this constant, and we can control that with a fractal, which is really neat. But some nodes, in some cases, you will not be able to control with a fractal, or you won't be able to control with a turbulence node or some other types of nodes. And basically it just won't work if it's not allowed to. I'm going to go ahead and just delete that right now. And we'll take a look at connecting those different controllers a little bit later. We can just go through some of our different options. We have a brightness and contrast, where we can adjust this overall effect. And like I said, you really want to pay attention to just that overall look of your function. It's also helpful if you can see it in the actual preview in the function editor. And note that a lot of these won't actually create any sort of a change. If I increase our brightness, we can see once it creates our terrain, it also resets itself. If I turn off fit vertically, we can see basically the same effect. So in some cases, a lot of these filters aren't really going to affect our terrains, and a lot of them are just there mainly for editing materials. And basically the best way to find out which ones work for terrains is just to try them out. Parabolic is a really cool filter node. It gives us 3 different options. We have an A, B, and a C, and we can adjust these overall values. And we can see those showing up within our output observer to adjust our terrain. We have the B value, which is our in-between, and then the C value, which is around our highest point. So basically we have the lowest point, our midpoint, and our highest point. We can also use these to connect directly to other nodes. So we can adjust our A, our B, and our C and connect those directly to fractal nodes if allowed. So what we can do is just extract this A, which will give us a direct constant node. I can change that to a fractal, which is allowed in this case. And now we get a really nice overall look for our lower value being controlled by, in this case, just a basic fractal. And of course we could change that to any of the different options, and we'll actually start creating different terrains a little bit later and modifying our different options. But let's go ahead and take a look at some of our other filters. We have an absolute value. You can see how that shows up. It would allow us to adjust our contrast and our threshold. And we can see how our black parts of our function, I'll go ahead and show that up in our graph too. See, as we adjust this threshold, those lower parts start to become a lot lighter. But we really only notice minimal change within the actual terrain itself. It is, of course, making modifications. And we can see the tightness and the overall sharpness between the elevation levels changing. But overall, in this case, it doesn't create too much of a dramatic effect, mostly because of that reset value. Once it actually calculates, then it changes the shape of our terrain to sort of fit in to make it look more like a terrain. We also have a gamma value. We can increase that. And now we can see we are lowering the overall amount by creating larger amounts of black area and just adjusting this overall gamma. We could also do it in the opposite direction. We can create very high amounts. We can see the effect of that. And it looks pretty neat. This can also be controlled by other nodes as well by extracting. And the majority of our nodes we can extract our parameters to control them by other things, or even the same options to create some pretty neat looking terrains. We could also use our bias. And if we take a look at that in the graph, we can compare these two and really see what the filter is exactly doing. So not only by looking at the actual direct effect, we can easily compare. And really it's the best way to learn exactly what every filter does, so that once you know you want to create something and you have a good idea of which filters do what, then you can quickly just add those filters in without having to play around with it. The gain option. We also have power. And then we can adjust our lower clip. And we can see that will raise up our gray value on the bottom. And some of these too won't show up correctly once we save this out, just because we have that fit vertically on. If we turn that off, we can see we have extremely high peaks. So if you are using a certain function and you want to make sure that it is going to work correctly, every once in a while you just want to click OK and take a look at it in your terrain editor just to make sure that everything looks correct. We have a Gaussian, which can give us a really neat looking effect. We can adjust our contrast and our threshold for this. And you can see we get a really neat looking terrain. And a lot of these effects can be achieved the same way through different filters. If we were to use just the standard filter where we actually were working with curves, this could easily be created with that as well. But it just gives you different options and different ways of working with the same thing. We have our clamp option, which allows us to clip out the lower parts of our terrain and the upper. So I can increase our lower clip, and now you can see that all of that bottom detail is now gone. And I can do our upper clip and bring that down. And now you can see our upper detail is now gone. If I turn off the fit vertically, we can see how the terrain is actually going to show up. Because we do have that higher amount of elevation. Because if we take a look at our colors and compare our fractal to our filter, we can see that overall effect that it is creating, and really how the elevation changes. And really they're quite close to each other. So if I was to close this out, this is how it would look in our terrain editor. We also just have a regular clip, which allows us to adjust the brightness, contrast, and then also our lower clip and upper clip. A smooth clip, which is very helpful if you want to create plateaus. I'm going to reduce our upper clip. And basically, the smooth clip allows us to clip out areas with a nice transitional smooth between our areas, so that way we don't get a very sharp edge around. We have a little bit of smoothing. And we can easily adjust the different values by using our brightness and contrast settings. Okay, so we'll go ahead and change that. We have a map mode with a lot of different options, also similar to some of the other ones. And then we can do a smooth map, which is basically the same with that smoothing for where our clip values are. We have a Quantize, which is a really neat look. It's basically a solarized filter if you were using another program. But we can adjust the steps, which is basically saying how many colors would we like to use to produce this overall fractal. So the higher number of steps, the more colors in our gradient. And we're basically just adjusting the amount of values that we have in order to create our specific terrain. And this is a really cool way for creating a sort of farming plateaus. We can also adjust the contrast. See how that raises our value, decrease our contrast, and we'll actually end up seeing less. So even with our step level at a higher amount, if our contrast is too low, we don't really get to see those overall steps. We increase that level a little bit higher, and we end up with a very interesting looking terrain. We can also adjust the brightness of that as well to raise up the overall values. We can do a saw wave. Now this is one of those ones, and one of those filters that isn't really going to work very well for terrains, and it's really mainly for materials. And that's just because we get these very sharp edges all the way around. Now if this is the sort of look you're going for, then definitely you can use it. But basically for creating a realistic looking terrain with a nice transition between certain edges, and where we don't have these very, very sharp edges all the way around, where it really just overall doesn't look very good. This is basically one of the ones you'll want to use more for editing materials and not so much for editing your terrains. Although you still can, and definitely you can connect these to other nodes if you want to control them. And you can definitely play around with it and see exactly what you get out of it. We also have an absolute wave, which works a little bit in the same way, but we have a lot more smoothing, and we don't have as much of that sharp cutoff like we do with our saw wave. Because if we take a look at our saw wave, we have a lot more inverted areas. If we take a look at the actual function, we can see the color where we have a very sharp areas because we have this white outline and then black right next to it, which is just going to create that very sharp cutoff. So the absolute wave will reduce those amounts of sharp cutoffs by not having the black and the white right next to each other. And if we adjust our contrast, we can see we can also achieve that same sort of result, but there is a lot better of a look overall than what we had before. As you can see, we get a pretty neat looking effect. If we go down to our last option within our main section, we just have a sine wave. And this allows us to basically create sort of the same type of effect. It gives us sort of dips on the higher elevations or the lower elevations, depending on how your settings are. But it gives you little pockets here and there throughout your terrain, which can give you some pretty neat looking effects, especially if you use them along with other nodes and other filters, and we can connect these to other values as well. We also have some environment sensitive options. I can change this to altitude. Now, since we are actually adjusting the altitude, a lot of these settings aren't really going to work out correctly. We can adjust our influence. And we can see it does make slight changes in the minimum and the maximum effect. But overall, once it refreshes, it pretty much looks the same. And we would really want to connect these to other nodes in order to get the correct effects. But basically, you just want to be paying attention to this output and really see what it looks like in order to really know if you want to use that node or not. We can also do it based on slope. Now we can see with the slope on, at the highest values, it's really not going to give us very much. And we can go through here and adjust these values, but we end up with basically the same effect. We can do altitude and slope together, the orientation, and I can see we basically just have gray throughout. So really, this is something you wouldn't want to use for a direct filter to be editing something like a fractal node, where we'd want to create a specific type of look. We also have the environment, which gives us a lot of different options where we can do altitude, slope, and orientation, plus the influence. And then we also have patches, which is a pretty neat look. It'll allow us to create some really nice looking plateaus. And we can just adjust these different values. The importance will adjust our smoothing on the sides. And then we can adjust our minimum effect, which will reduce these overall areas. And the maximum effect, which is going to adjust the plateaued areas. And then we can adjust our slope in that manner. Of course, we really don't see that much of an impact. If we're looking at the actual node as it's recalculating, we can see the whiter areas do start to come out a little bit more. And once we bring down that max effect on the slope, we lose that sort of plateau look. And now we're sort of in back in that grayer mode. So we'd have to increase that. But there's a lot of different filter options that we can use. We can combine them with other objects, and you'll see that a little bit better when we're connecting everything and working on specific types of terrains.